talks today. She's going to talk about how production systems affect yield and quality in organic blueberry production.
Great, thank you. Well, I do want to precede this by saying this project has been funded by the Washington Blueberry Commission and the Oregon Blueberry Commission. And it's been a long-term study, and next season will be the last year of this particular project where we're looking at various treatments over time. So what I want to do today is sort of give you an update predominantly on what happened in 2013, but because we've got such long-term data, I'm going to show the yield progression and the cumulative yield in this particular trial. And I'm a firm believer that whether you're a conventional or an organic grower, I think you'll get useful information out of this. I know a lot of conventional growers that I work with have found our results, particularly on weed mat, to be really interesting. So I'm not an organic researcher, but apparently now have the only 2 organically certified research plantings on berry crops in the world. So all of a sudden I am apparently an organic researcher on, at least on these particular crops. So what I want to go over in the 40 minutes that I've been allotted is just highlight the objectives of the study, and then I really want to make sure you understand the treatments because they've been in place for the 8 years of this study. And I want to talk about the impacts of soil temperature on plant, what we think on plant performance, and we've been collecting irrigation data as well, so I'll talk about that. And then the long-term impacts of these treatments on soil nutrition as well as plant nutrition. We have 8 years of data on tissue testing and soil testing and all these things and how they're correlated and which of those are correlated with yield, and that's going to be very interesting. And we're collecting data on the cost of all these. I won't have time to talk about it today, but it's really important to me, having been raised on a farm, to make sure that what we recommend are actually feasible. So this is a picture of the planting this past season. I do want to share that we are OMRI, we use only OMRI approved products. We're Oregon Tilth certified. I wanted to jump through the same hoops as commercial growers have to do. We're GAP certified, and we sell our fruit, and that income goes back into the research study. And with that, we have to guarantee, at least to the best of our ability, that we are spotted wing Drosophila free. So I also have to manage spotted wing Drosophila in this organic planting, which is a lot easier to do for Duke because we don't spray. But for our Liberty, we have to spray with, and we've had very good success to date. So the key objectives are, we're looking at various certified organic production systems and the effect on Duke and Liberty, our 2 fresh market cultivars. And we picked those because Duke is our problem child, and Liberty we thought was very vigorous and would be easy to grow organically, and what a surprise, we've proved those things to be true. And we're also comparing raised versus flat ground production because we have very good soil, very well-drained soil, and we thought, well, why are we recommending raised beds if the soil might indicate it's not necessary? So we thought we'd compare raised versus flat. And weed management was considered by our advisory board, who's been invaluable, extremely valuable in helping us establish this trial and manage the trial. Weed management was the #1 concern, and that was, of course, before spotted wing Drosophila, in growing blueberries organically, and so that's a big focus of this study. And fertilizer. They're expensive, and how difficult is it to manage plant fertility in organic systems? So our treatments, we established the planting in October 2006. Here's the raised and the flat. That's one of our big planting treatments. We have our 2 cultivars, as I mentioned earlier, why we chose those. And here are our weed management treatments. We have 3. We have, at the time in 2006, sawdust mulch was the standard. And now I would say a lot of our plantings are going in weed mat, and we probably take partial credit for that because they've performed in our trials so well. Sawdust, we only use hand pulling of weeds. We don't like to hoe on raised beds. Then we have our second treatment, which is a compost sawdust sandwich, and that's a yard debris compost topped with about 2 inches of sawdust. And my goal there was to have the sawdust, which is a dry material. Weed seeds don't germinate very readily when they land in sawdust. In contrast, yard debris is very nutrient rich. It has a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, which is shown on the right there. It stays moist longer, and when weed seeds land in that product, they germinate very readily. So I thought, well, let's do a sandwich, and maybe we can get the benefit of sawdust and have the nutrient benefit of compost. In that particular treatment, we're using OMRI-approved organic herbicides, and if needed, if those don't work, we use hand weeding. And then we have weed mat where there's sawdust in that planting hole area, and we hand weed those out if necessary, and we've been keeping track of all the costs. One thing I want to point out is that kind of the chemical makeup, we analyzed our organic materials. We are analyzing everything, the fertilizers, the mulches, because we want to know what nutrients are going in. And then an important question becomes is when are those nutrients available to the plants? When do they show up in the soil and in the tissue? And we have data on that now. So sawdust has a very low pH. Compost, yard debris compost, extremely well composted. It has a low carbon to nitrogen ratio compared to sawdust. And sawdust can be a lot higher than that. Has a high pH. And so we did not incorporate any of these organic materials prior to planting. In fact, we did in a separate experiment incorporated that high pH yard compost, and the soil pH jumped up very quickly. So we don't want to incorporate that, but we're using it as a top surface mulch topped with sawdust. And also notice the high potassium, and I'll talk more about that. So with weed management, I do want to stress we've been replenishing these mulches as needed. Again, the planting started in October 2006, so we needed to put on new sawdust and new compost plus sawdust in the winter of 2010-11 and just recently. And our weed mat we replaced a little bit early because we're poking holes through it to get soil samples, and also we wanted to put in a zippered system. As you can see kind of in this light on the top right, so that we can open it and add products if needed. And that is being done successfully commercially. Of course, as weed mat wears down, this is your only option for putting weed mat into an established planting, is to have a zippered system. That works very well. So I want to show you with the mulch, what have we applied in terms of nutrients. And like I said, we're analyzing this. So here's when we applied mulches or replenished mulches. And look at all the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and calcium and magnesium that are in those mulches. How quickly are those available to the plants? This is something that we're monitoring because it's a very different system than using sawdust mulch alone. Our fertilizers are feather meal. It's a granular product. We're applying it as a split, so the total rate of nitrogen is divided in half, and that's applied in March. And in mid-May, we found that if we went any later than that, it wasn't available. And then we have our liquid fish emulsion, which is divided into 7 equal applications. And we dilute that because it has a high salt content. So we're diluting it 1 to 10 before we're applying it. So when the plants were young, we applied the fertilizer by hand around the plants. When they got older, we used a broadcast liquid application under the weed mat for the fish and a broadcast band, as we call it, in the row for the feather. And now we're applying the fish through the drip irrigation system with great success. And we're applying the feather meal as a broadcast band under the weed mat or on top of the organic mulches. And these are our target rates of nitrogen, from a low, we'll call it, to a high. And recently we've been applying a low as 65 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre, and our high is 125. Now that is based on what the label says. But we analyzed the fertilizer products, and while we wanted to put 125 down, we actually applied less than that. because there was less nitrogen in the product than they said. And that's not unusual with organic products because they change 1 year's batch from the next. Here's feather meal, just showing you the high rate of feather meal. This is the first application this spring under the weed mat. And here's what's actually applied last year. You can see that we wanted to apply 125, but we only had 100 because of the lower nitrogen in the product. And you can see also that we have a higher rate of potassium being applied when we use fish compared to feather. And we have a higher amount of phosphorus being applied when we use fish compared to feather. And feather meal has higher calcium than fish. So the take-home message is, with these organic products, unlike a conventional fertilizer blend, we have less control over the other nutrients that we're applying in addition to the nitrogen that we want in the product. And that's something that we're monitoring and following. So here's a picture of the planting when it was first established. Here's our pH at establishment, our organic matter at establishment. And as I said, we did not add organic matter into the soil prior to planting. So first, on weed management, there are a lot of benefits attributed to using organic mulches. A lot of data has been published, but all of those data relate organic mulches compared to bare soil treatments. And often those are in unirrigated southeastern fields in those studies. But we do know that compared to bare soil, there's advantages. So what's the difference between organic mulches and weed mat, which is a more common comparison here? And I hope this shows up well. What we've found in our study over the 8 years is that adding compost to the mulching program has increased the weeds that are present in the row. And it's not because the compost has weed seeds. It does not. It's because the weed seeds are blowing in and they're germinating readily. And even though I had this great idea of this sandwich, it doesn't work because the sawdust erodes off the top of the mulch very quickly. When you pull a weed, or when there's a rodent or a vole or something goes in there, and all of a sudden the compost is on top. So the sandwich isn't maintained, and they germinate much more readily, even compared to sawdust here. And of course there's hardly anything in the weed mat. And this is this spring. We're starting to see grasses come into our sawdust mulch, which are more difficult to control. Sawdust works well on annual weeds, less so on perennial. So when we look at labor hours, you don't need to look at this too carefully, but here's when our organic mulches were replenished. And what I want to point out is, here's the labor hours required to spray herbicide in the compost, plus sawdust treatment. Here's the added hand weed labor hours. And then here's the total labor hours compared, this is per acre, compared to sawdust and compared to weed mat, just pulling weeds around the plant. So you can see as we go here, the weed pressure increases to where the hours increase, and then we replenish and get new mulch on, and boom, our weed labor hours go down again. And then they go up very quickly again, and we seem to have relatively little effect on labor hours with replenishing, and that's because of the grasses. And if we look at the labor hours required, we are getting an advantage to using organic herbicides for the first time in these recent years to reduce our labor hours for weeding, comparing this treatment to this. And in the weed mat, well, it's hardly any weed management hours compared to the other treatments. So replenishing organic mulches for weed control is really important in this type of production system to minimize your weed management costs. Boy, I wish this would show up better. This light is terrible. We did start by using concentrated acetic acid or vinegar as for spot spraying, and that worked quite well. The field smelled like fish and chips when you had the fish fertilizer and the vinegar. And if we got a hot day, we had pretty good control, but bigger weeds were more difficult to control. And since then, we've been using pretty much exclusively green match, a lemongrass oil, which is now called Avenger, and that's been working quite well for us. And it's not an inexpensive product, but if you spot spray, we've been able to keep the cost, I think, manageable, especially because we've been reducing the labor hours required to hand pull. And hot weather after application benefits with this product also. So for weed management, by far our best treatment has been weed mat for controlling weeds. And we use a string trimmer for the edges, and that works really well. And we use hand pulling when needed, and that's worked and is much more cost effective. You pay for the weed mat very quickly when you amortize it over the life of the weed mat. We've been monitoring soil temperatures and water use and what has been the impact of this production system. And just for your information, these tubes are for measuring root growth and looking at the impact. I won't be talking about that today, but there's a postdoc, Luis Valenzuela, who's working on this aspect of the study. So when we look at soil temperature, it has been warmer under the weed mat, and I thought this would stop once the bushes got big and shaded the weed mat, and that has not been the case. What mainly controls the difference in temperature between weed mat and the sawdust is whether or not the sawdust needs to be replenished or not. So if your mulch is very fresh, then we have much cooler temperatures under the mulch. Warmer in the winter, cooler in the summer, compared to weed mat. And so we have warmer temperatures, and it's been considerably consistent through, this is last year, and we have temperature differences of as much as 9 degrees Fahrenheit or 5 Celsius where it's warmer. And that's a considerable difference and can certainly affect root growth, and that's something that we're looking at. Related to that, we have bigger tops with perhaps smaller roots. And that is, I think, leading to more water use with weed mat than with the organic systems. You'd think we don't, it's not enough soil evaporation issue because the weed mat's also helping reduce evaporation compared to bare soil. But we're using as much as 117 gallons per plant per season more with weed mat than we are with organic mulches. And this is something to keep in mind, perhaps not as much on cost of pumping, but certainly on availability of water. And we are looking at the long-term impacts on that. So let me talk about yield here, and as I said, we started picking in the second year of the study, the second growing season, which was 2008. I pruned those plants that were not large enough to support a crop were not allowed to support a crop. So I approached it from a commercial grower's perspective, or how I would like a commercial grower to approach it, and pruned each plant on an individual basis. So if there were 3 plants in the plot big enough, they were allowed to produce some fruit, less than a half kilo a plant. Those that weren't were pruned harder to encourage vegetative growth. And so the yield in 2008 reflects that. Our pruning since then has been the same, balancing the capable yield of the plant with vegetative growth. This is our first pick in Liberty, and just showing, it was actually a cloudy day, mid-July, first Liberty harvest for us in 2013. And one thing I want to point out is we have blueberry shock virus in this plot. So we adjusted yield for shock, because shock, I don't think, is a treatment effect. Does that make sense? So the organic management system does not affect a pollen-borne virus. So that means that if half the plot was not fruiting because of shock, the yield was increased or doubled because half the plot was not fruiting because of shock. So that's an adjusted yield, so that's not confounding the data. And we did see shock in both Duke and Liberty. However, if there were plants missing, it was very likely a treatment effect because the rate of fertilizer was too high, or it's flat versus raised in Duke. For those reasons, that yield was not adjusted, so that if you were a grower that had an acre field and you lost 10% of your plants, your yield is 10% down. So that is not, so when you see yield per acre, it does account for missing plants because they didn't like the treatment. So the first thing I want to talk about is raised beds, and despite having excellent soil, we have had a consistently higher yield on raised beds, particularly, this will surprise you, it surprised me, not particularly in Duke, particularly in Liberty. Liberty yield has been consistently higher on raised beds than on flat over the 8 years of this study. And cumulative yield has been 22% higher on raised and flat, and that's a significant chunk of change. When we look at cultivar effects, I wanted to show this to you. Now remember, these yields are averaged from the best treatments, fertilizer, mulch, to the worst. So keep that in mind when you look at the actual yield here. We got about almost 6 ton an acre average on Liberty last year in year 7 of this study. But look at the nice progression of yield in Liberty. And we were doing the same thing, this is typical for us in Duke. Duke sort of, it doesn't increase regularly, and then boom. We had a crappy yield in Duke in 2013, but it was not a treatment effect. It was a bird effect. We had tremendous bird pressure in our early Duke, and this is a picture I took of a plot before the first harvest, and I mean, literally the birds came out and cleaned a third of our yield out before the first pick, and it's the first year we've had real problems with that. So our yield in Duke was down this year, and by the time Liberty came on, the birds had found somewhere else to go, which was quite fortunate. Looking at the mulch effects on yield, it has been, this is averaged over cultivar and averaged over raised versus flat, but typically our weed mat in most years has had a higher yield than the sawdust, and the compost plus sawdust has been a bit higher, but no dramatic differences in long-term yield. This is yield added over all the years that they've been fruiting so far, so no dramatic differences. When we look at last year, 2013, there was an interaction between mulch and fertilizer, and that means that some fertilizers were better than others when they were grown with a certain type of mulch. And what it was weed mat. If we fertilized with feather meal, the yield in weed mat was way higher than if we fertilized with fish. And with the other types of mulches, compost and sawdust, there was no difference. It didn't matter what fertilizer we used, so that's interesting. Another place we see an interaction is how the cultivars responded to the different fertilizers. So this is 2013's yield in ton per acre, and the orange is Liberty, and this is their yield, about 6 ton an acre, and it didn't matter whether they got the low rate, 65 pounds of nitrogen per acre, or the high rate, 125 pounds of nitrogen per acre. It didn't matter, the yield was the same. Didn't matter if it was fish, didn't matter if it was feather. That's not the case with Duke. What a surprise. Duke is picky when it comes to fertilizer. And the low rate of feather and the high rate of feather had much higher yield than fish. And especially the low rate of fish, although these are not significantly different. This year, when we look at it over the 8 years of the study, there is a significant difference. Duke does not like a high rate of fish. So, let's look at some of these other berry traits. So first on berry weight, Duke has bigger fruit than Liberty, and Duke fruit tend to be smaller when you fertilize with a high rate of fish. And I'm not just talking last year, I'm talking every single year of the study. So it actually is pretty significant. What's interesting though, it's not a huge difference. Is that biologically different? I don't know, but it is statistically significant every year of the study. Liberty has smaller fruit when we fertilize with feather than with fish, and that has happened every year of the study. When we look at sugar, bricks, percent soluble solids, Liberty is much sweeter, consistently so. This is averaged over all years of the study than Duke. And Duke tends to have sweeter fruit when they're fertilized with fish. So smaller berries, sweeter fruit when they're fertilized with fish compared. Too bad the yield is also low. If we got paid for bricks, maybe we could think about it. Firmness, of course, Duke is much firmer than Liberty. And Duke has significantly firmer fruit when fertilized with high fish. So low yield, small berries, high firmness. Perhaps not something you'd want to farm for, but anyway, it's interesting. And in Liberty, we also have slightly firmer fruit when fertilized with fish, high rate especially. So I want to talk now about the nutrient impacts in the soil and what's happening in organic matter and nutrient status. And I want to remind you of all the nutrients that we have applied. First, in the fertilizer, we're not only applying different rates of nitrogen, but potassium, magnesium, phosphorus, sodium is in fish. We have some sulfur in fish. And we have more boron in fish than in feather, and feather has more calcium than fish. So even though we're modifying our nitrogen rate, we're also modifying these other macro and micronutrients. And on top of that, we are adding sawdust and compost in some of our mulch treatments. And in the compost in particular, we're very high in nitrogen, so how quickly is that available? And then we're very high in phosphorus. Is that available? What about potassium? Very high. And does that affect these other nutrients like calcium and magnesium? So these are things that we're starting to get at. And to be honest, we're just starting to get at them. So I'll just give you some of our early ideas. But first of all, this is soil. And I'm only going to focus on a few things in the soil. First of all, pH. In my earlier presentation, I talked about how when you fertilize, you lower pH. Well, that occurs with organic products as well as with conventional products. And so what we're doing really over time, no lime has been added in these systems. Over time, we see pH drop because we're fertilizing. Well, one thing that the compost plus sawdust system is doing is helping to mitigate that a bit because the compost has a high pH. If we're applying that even in small amounts on the top, it's actually ending up that that's helping keep our pH in a good zone for blueberry. Because if you look at our other treatments like sawdust in particular, it has our lowest pH, sawdust does. And so this is helping keep our pH in a good range, and whereas if we go much longer over time, we're going to have to fight this drop in pH in the sawdust by adding lime to the system. Weed mat also has a higher pH. That's more of a ammonium nitrogen management system, water system that I'm not going to talk about today, but it is also typical for weed mat to have that happen where pH drifts up. In organic matter, this is a huge benefit of compost plus sawdust, which has a low carbon nitrogen ratio. We started in 2006 with an organic matter content of 3.7%. Within 2 years, we had increased organic matter in the compost by 4.6, not 3.7. Huge increase. And with some blips here as the compost has been decomposing and has needed to be replenished, we are at a much higher organic matter content with our compost plus sawdust mulch than even we are with sawdust. And as has been confirmed in tree fruit systems, long-term use of weed mat with no added organic matter is dropping soil organic matter in the soil under the weed mat. And that's because of that higher temperature. There's more mineralization of the organic matter in the soil, more loss of the organic matter in the soil, and that should be a concern with use of weed mat, is needing to find a system, and we're working on this, where you can add organic matter to the system. And with a zippered system, that's possible, because that's not good for blueberries. They like higher organic matter. And then potassium, that's very high in the compost, and we can see a much higher soil potassium level under the compost. The mulches are removed when we test the soil. Under the compost system, we have significantly higher potassium in the soil. So that potassium is very quickly available in the soil to the plants. And so what impact is that going to have on all the cations? So just to show you that we do have soil pH, particularly at the high rate of feather and at the high rate of fish, our soil pH over the years of the study is lower than at the low rates of nitrogen, confirming fertilizing lowers pH. And here's for just this last year, our lowest soil pHs are with the high rates of fertilizer. So here are some leaf nutrient data. And first of all, this is leaf tissue potassium on the top left. And let's see here. Yes, this is the effect of fertilizer on leaf potassium. This is the effect of mulch on leaf potassium. And here's the effect of cultivar on leaf potassium. The red lines indicate our current sufficiency levels that I talked about earlier this morning. What is the range recommended? And then we have the different rates of fertilizer, the different mulches, and the cultivars. So the first thing is that we are within sufficiency levels. For all of these years, we collected these most recently fully expanded leaves on blueberry shoots below a fruiting zone, not on a whip, and had those tested, and we're falling within the sufficiency level. So nothing is jumping out saying that after all this time of having potassium in the soil, are we seeing a dramatic change in leaf potassium. But I will say that with the added potassium that's in the fish, we are seeing higher soil potassium and higher leaf potassium with fish fertilizer. Is it a concern yet in what it's doing to other nutrients? Not yet, but we are seeing a trend downward for magnesium, and that might be a concern. Secondly, we have compost is increasing leaf potassium, but it's slowly. And so we'll have to look at the impact of that. And look at the cultivar differences in potassium. Duke has a much higher leaf potassium content than Liberty, and it just illustrates that varieties differ in these nutrient concentrations, and that's something that we want to look at. So I do want to say we had these years' data for nutrient concentration, we have the yield, and we have all these associated data. So what's related to yield? Well, leaf potassium has been negatively related to yield. So the higher the leaf potassium in the current season, the lower the yield. And we have that for four of our 6 fruiting seasons so far, that's been the case. So that's kind of interesting and something we need to look further at. And we have a positive correlation for 4 fruiting seasons with leaf calcium in the current season and yield. So these are, we always think about nitrogen, but we've found no relationship between leaf nitrogen and yield with the exception of yield in 2 of our years early on. This was the 4th fruiting season, and this was the that's the 2nd fruiting season, and this is the 3rd. We had a negative correlation. So when leaf nitrogen was high the previous year, yield was down the next year. And that's related to that fruit bud initiation, what we were talking about before. I will say that this field, none of them look overly vigorous where I'd go, ooh, I'm worried about, but I guess it was a subtle thing because I didn't visually see a difference between these. But other than that, there's been no correlation between yield and leaf nitrogen. So that's something to be aware of. So wrapping up here, what's the impact on yield? Raised beds are the way to go. I mean, I wouldn't want to plant on the flat. I think it would be too risky, even in good soil. So I'm pretty confident with that. This organic system's a tough test, and that's something that I'm pretty comfortable with. I think it's aeration in the soil and better root growth. We've had the highest cumulative yield with weed mat, and in Duke there's a fertilizer effect, so we have the highest yield with feather meal or the low rate of fish, and a higher rate of nitrogen using fish has not been good for Duke, whereas Liberty has been pretty plastic. It doesn't matter what rate or source of fertilizer that we've used. And it's pretty tough when leaf nitrogen is not correlated with yield. So now we're trying to find some other tools. We'll get more years' data to see about this because this is a concern. And I would say there's probably a caution in here. That doesn't mean crank up the growth. That's not what it means. Because one of the things you've got to realize is that the comment I made earlier about leaf nitrogen, the reason leaf nitrogen you can't go with the numbers alone is because it's what the plant looks like. You can have very high leaf nitrogen when the growth isn't very good. And you can have very high leaf nitrogen when they're growing to the roof. So that's why probably leaf nitrogen is not related to yield, because it's just so much affected by growth also. Weeds, by far our weed mat has been the most cost effective. And when we look at weed mat, we have this greater temperature. We are looking at the impacts on root growth. It's reducing soil organic matter. The pH is staying high, but that's a good thing when we're fertilizing, but the organic matter might be a bad thing. And I just want to mention here, I don't have time to cover it, but under weed mat, our soil nitrate levels in late fall have been highest, much higher. And I think that's a temperature issue, as we're getting more nitrification under the weed mat than under the organic mulches. And so when you're looking at nitrogen management, that might be an issue, particularly if you're pushing the envelope on your rates, which we are not, I don't believe. Compost plus sawdust does look very good, but we need to get around how much more weed management we have in this treatment, and we need to be confident that it's a sustainable system where the higher soil potassium is not going to be a problem for plant nutrient balance. All right, I'll just leave it at that, and I think I have, it looks like I have maybe 5 minutes left for questions, unless we want to.
Yeah, are there any questions? Daryl?
Okay. On your mulch, are you finding more mouse problems going on with that sod, whether on the mulch, that sawdust?
Our mulch types are affecting rodent presence, particularly in our organic system where we do not have good rodent control capability, like rodenticides are very limited. I've been told maybe release snakes under the weed mat, and I'm not going there. It's just, we have raptors and raptor perches, but the voles and the mice can hide under the weed mat. So the weed mat is literally moving at some times. What's interesting is that in the organic mulches, the rodents don't like it as much, particularly when it's fresh, because they'll burrow and then it caves in, and that doesn't happen under the weed mat, and of course they have protection. With that said, other than creating perhaps greater soil porosity than I'd like and making water management probably more difficult and all these other problems, I'm not seeing a direct effect on plant growth and yield, because those are our best yielding treatments.
I was kind of a little bit surprised in a row fumigation, just banded fumigation under the plastic. We put quite a bit of compost on, and the amount of mice that found its way underneath that whole mat. And one more question, is there any truth to the part about the rate between calcium, potash, and magnesium as a 10-3-1 ratio?
I'll put on a soil scientist hat. I'm not one, but in fact we just had a blueberry workshop November 22nd, and a soil scientist who I respect tremendously said ratios are crap. And the reason he said it, he didn't use those words, the reason he said it was because, there's some truth to big swings in ratios, but to use exact ratios to manage a fertility program, you're never going to be right, and so it's a losing battle. So look at the tissue levels to decide what your soil should be at. Tom?
Do you have any thoughts on the negative correlation? Do you have any thoughts on the negative correlation between leaf potassium and yield?
Do I have any thoughts on the negative correlation between leaf potassium and yield? It's a very good question, and I haven't thought about it too much, so I kind of hate to make any judgments, but there's a lot of potassium in the fruit, and so it's possible that there is a negative relationship because of that.
Question.
When you saw the high amount of nitrate toward the end of the season, did you also find high amount of salt index? I've seen a correlation between high nitrate and high salts, and blueberries have a tendency not to like high salt soils.
That's right. The blueberry tolerance for salts is around 2 decisiemens per meter. Our soil nitrate levels were not so high that they were above that salt tolerance level, but there was a significant difference, like where the weed mat was triple the other mulches. Not at high level. And keep in mind that our rates of nitrogen are not that high with, you know, especially the low, but even the high at 125 pounds. But still, the fact that there was a big difference between those mulches is indicative of all that mineralization that's occurring later in the season, and one of the reasons why our organic matter is dropping. But you're right to be worried about high nitrate levels and salt, but those would be much higher than what we found.
Great. Well, let's thank Bernadine.